Welcome to the CharityVillage Connects podcast. A recent TELUS Health Mental Health Index indicates that employees experiencing workplace conflict lose up to 55 days in productivity per year. The impacts of conflict at work are clear: lost productivity, but also stress and diminished mental health for the staff who experience it. In this episode, we explore the contributing factors, including power dynamics, racism, and microaggressions, and mounting workloads. We'll outline an organization's legal obligations to take action and leave you with some practical solutions and strategies. Please welcome Rensia Melles, founder of Integral Workplace Health and manager of clinical operations for Canada at Lyra Health, formerly ICAS World. Rensia is a certified psychological health and safety advisor with over 20 years of experience managing and designing international employee support programs for Fortune 500 employers and nonprofits alike. Welcome, Rensia.
Hi, Mary. Good to be here.
In November, TELUS Health published findings from their mental health index indicating that workers who experience conflict at work lose an average of 55 workdays per year. What are your thoughts on this? What do you think it means for an employee to lose a workday?
Okay, so Mary, this is actually usually when we talk, I end up telling you that it's actually worse than what the stats are showing. This is one where I think we need to be a little cautious in understanding the stats. It's not clear how conflict is defined and how many people are actually reporting that they're actively experiencing conflict in the workplace. So I think the situation is actually a little less dire than the stats would imply or what the headline would imply. Because the same research found that most people in the workplace, over 2/3 actually, and up to 3/4 of the people actually define their or characterize their coworkers as kind as instead of hostile, and as trustworthy as opposed to untrustworthy. So there's some negative things that they think about their coworkers, but overall people experience their relationships and their coworkers positively. That doesn't take away from the fact, though, that conflict, as you mentioned, definitely has an impact on mental health. It has an impact on the individual, and it has a lot to do with how the workplace context functions around addressing conflict, allowing conflict, and making it safe to address conflict, and what they do then. So that there's no two ways that is an important factor in employee mental health, whether it's a small percentage or a big percentage of people, it has an impact. The other piece is, the 55 days of lost work. Disability claims and the rise in disability claims doesn't actually match that kind of a rise in people going on long-term disability. But what we are seeing is that there is a huge increase in the cost of and the uptake of mental health provisions. So a lot of insurance plans have accepted more providers. For instance, it used to be only psychologists. A lot of insurance plans will now accept social workers and registered psychotherapists instead of just going for the PhD level counselors. So there's more resources available. There's more awareness. So definitely the uptake on that has been the fastest growing and is the largest segment of cost on the paramedic aspects of health insurance. So there's no two ways that there's an impact, that things are going on in the workplace, and that there is an increased need for mental health and well-being support in the workplace. And conflict obviously plays a role in that. But when we're talking about 55 lost days, I think that is a combination of people taking sick days, perhaps being more prepared to take a sick day because they are more aware. So whereas in the past they would have just tried and powered through, they're more willing to say, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm just going to take the day off because I'm so stressed or I'm so upset. So that's part of it. I think also that is a loss that could be attributed to presenteeism, where people are going to work but not performing well, where they are distracted, where they are not able to produce, or they're just being there without actually being able to produce. So that is a huge economic cost for employers, but it's also a very unfulfilling for employees because despite what we think that people don't want to work or whatever stereotypes we have, people actually like being productive. People like feeling that they're contributing and that they have something to do and have a purpose. So when you're not engaged in the workplace and feeling that sense of purpose, that does affect people's mental health. So it is an important stat. I'm not quite sure it needs to be read exactly the way that it's presented, but there is definitely underlying truths that are relevant for employers and employees to be aware of.
Well, as you said, we've certainly seen ongoing trends in reports since before the pandemic about declining employee engagement and increasing mental health concerns. Do these contribute to a potential increase in workplace conflict?
Yeah, and it's almost common sense, Mary, because yes, if I'm not feeling well, if I'm stressed, I'm going to be much more vulnerable. I'm going to be much more vulnerable to taking something the wrong way. It may be much harder for me to engage in a conversation to actually address the issue. I might shy away more. If I'm already struggling with some level of anxiety or high stress, my conflict resolution skills are going to be affected and my vulnerability to experiencing something as a conflict rather than a solvable disagreement or different instruments that we can come up with a compromise. So those things definitely play a role because we just change our whole cognitive interpretation of the situation when we're in poor mental health.
And what's the impact on an employee's mental health when they are involved with conflict at work?
Well, you know what? That's actually a complex question because conflict and experience of conflict doesn't equal poor mental health. It has everything to do with how that conflict is managed, what my expectations are about how it's going to be managed, what my expectations of outcome are, whether I have expectations that I'm going to be heard or whether it's, I'm just going to be steamrolled. So conflict in and of itself isn't the problem. I may be more vulnerable to, thinking that something is an insult when I'm more stressed out than otherwise, but it has a lot to do with, the real impact is going to be when I want to bring that up with somebody or with whether that's my manager, whether it's my employer or with my coworker, are they going to listen? Are there going to be repercussions for that? And is there an opportunity for us to come to a fair resolve or some kind of mutual understanding? Those are the factors that ultimately make a difference. But that's also, of course, a definition of a psychologically safe environment where I feel that I can speak up, that I can do that without repercussions, and that, there will be an effort made to come to an agreement with each other.
Do you think that the impacts are different depending on whether the conflict is with another coworker, a manager, or with clients? How do differing power dynamics lead to different responses from individuals?
Absolutely. Different power dynamics are going to play a role in how conflict affects me. To some extent, personality plays a role as well, but definitely if I'm in the lower manage or in the lower power position, it may be much harder for me to address the conflict. I may not feel that it's safe depending on the manager. And I may not have the belief that I can come up with a just outcome. When you look at, for instance, like happiness index around the world, what you find is that the highest rated countries for the happiness index, these are countries that have one, a solid belief in the rule of law and equality, and that also have an expectation of social fairness and justice. So this is why, like the Scandinavian countries are often at the top there. And the same actually applies in the workplace. If I have the idea that I can expect that I will be heard, and I expect that there will be some form of just outcome, that will make a difference. And obviously, if I'm in the lower power position, that plays a role. And in relationship to the client, that's also a really interesting one because how I am with the client That's called psychological or emotional labor in the workplace. Because when I'm with a client, I need to be polite. I need to be smiling. If I'm greeting people, if I'm talking to people that are rude to me on the phone, I can't say, well, you're whatever, and hang up. I have to continue that conversation. So there's a couple of things that are really important there. For one, the company definitely needs to have your back and make it very clear that rude callers, are not tolerated, that, if people are continually rude, that the company will draw the line for you, because it's very difficult to do that on your own. The other thing is that, when you recognize that dealing with a client is emotional labor, and sometimes it is really hard because people are frustrated. It's not even malice. People are frustrated. Maybe they're not in their, they're stressed out. They're having some mental health issues. And so they can be very rude or abrasive, racist, to the person they're talking to on the phone. And part of that is also recognizing that as an employer and giving people the space to then walk away, to go and talk to somebody, to debrief, to let go, and to have like a safe space, to be flexible, to allow people to, just go grab a coffee or a tea and get away from that customer and just take the time to recalibrate before they engage with the next person. So absolutely, who you're having conflict with and the power dynamic makes a big difference.
It can be tempting for managers to avoid dealing with low level conflict on their teams, considering it perhaps just personality differences. But is addressing workplace conflict a factor in creating a psychologically safe workplace? What should managers and leaders know about what their responsibility is?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. And I always feel so bad for managers, when these things come up, because managers really, they do need to address it. They need to be able to recognize it. They need to have the diplomatic skills to address it with the individual, to make it safe. Managers themselves are under a lot of stress. And, I don't know how your experience is, Mary, but my experience is always that frontline workers and the managers often have very different perspective. And certainly in the nonprofit sector, where people are working with the front line, where they're working with the clients, if it's a nonprofit sector where people are dealing with, clients in need. So they may not know the full story. The manager may be bound by not being allowed to tell the whole story. Um, so yeah, definitely, a workplace that can be transparent as much as possible creates a safe place to address conflict and to prevent conflict. So there are definitely, addressing it as part of it, but you need to also have your managers trained to do this. You can't just say, part of your task is to deal with this conflict and, watch the people and then talk to them. I always have great sympathy for managers caught in the middle on those things. But yes, it's a large part of it.
So, if we look on the other side of the spectrum, provided that the situation isn't one of bullying, abuse, or harassment, how can employees create a better relationship with their manager? How could they learn to be more assertive, for example, in expressing their needs and looking for having their rights protected?
That's a good one. I'm not always assuming that it is about the employee needing to be more assertive. It is about creating the safe space. And I think the first start to an effective conversation between a manager and an employee who may be coming from very different interests, very different perspectives on what needs to be done, is to understand each other and to acknowledge each other as individuals, to see that person on your team not just as a worker but as a human being, as a person with a personality and needs and different places that they're coming from, with a task, with a commitment to that task. And for the employee also, they need to understand the manager. So often it's not about coming on stronger, it's about understanding and finding common ground with each other so that you can come to a good understanding. And if you can have a conversation where you can actually ask each other questions and find common ground and some level of transparency with each other, I think that's the basis. Then assertiveness is not the issue. The issue is then at that point is goodwill and working on that common ground to willingness to understand each other and to come to a good compromise within the framework that both of you are working in.
There's an increasing discussion about how workplaces can be trauma informed. How does this play into managing or resolving workplace conflict?
Well, if you're aware that somebody has experienced trauma or is part of a social group that has a much higher risk of having experienced trauma, whether, and that can be, social trauma, it can be cultural trauma, it can also be people that have refugees or new Canadians. So, you can kind of think about, who might be at a higher risk of having this kind of baggage that they're bringing with them, this kind of a burden that they carry with them. And so, yes, you need to be aware of that, and that it can play out in different ways. If you're going to be trauma informed, it means that you need to make it really safe. So that may be one of them, and understand that somebody who comes from a traumatic background or traumatic experience may be very unwilling to address um, what's going on because they're anxious, they're already stressed, and they may not trust the situation. They may not have had an experience that tells them it's okay. Even if it's okay in your work environment, they might need a little bit of extra reassurance or outreach around that. The other side, of course, is that somebody who has a trauma experience, and depending on who they are and how recent, for instance, they may have much more trouble with emotional regulation. So they may come on more emotional, they may come out more tearful or sorrowful, or they may come on very reactive or very seemingly impulsive or aggressive. And again, this is where you just need to cut people some slack and recognize that, not take it personal, set back, and try to understand that individual and meet them where they are. And I do think that, somebody from a traumatic experience, a traumatic background, does deserve to get that extra recognition and that extra effort that you would put in when you're communicating with them.
Well, Rensia, any final thoughts you'd like to share with managers or employees who might be struggling with how to deal with conflict at work?
You know what? There's a lot of different things that you can say. And circumstances are going to be different in different employees. Like, it depends on between people, between corporate cultures. But there are some best practice things that you can start with. One of them is recognizing and normalizing mental health. Everybody has mental health. Some days it's strong, some days it's down. Sometimes that's because of what's going on at work, and sometimes it's because their mother isn't doing well, or their kid is having difficulty at school, or maybe it's just something that happened with them. They had a rotten night of sleep. So normalizing and accepting that, and say, there's people have off days, and they have strong and they have less strong days. That's part one. And one of the things that's really helpful in the workplace, of course, is when managers acknowledge it, but when and managers also own it, where a manager can say, I'm not myself today, you know. Uh, so that's setting the modeling for people to be able to make it safe to say these things, to acknowledge it, and then to accommodate as needed. The other thing is, I think we need to let go of the concept, that we have this myth about productivity, that there's such a thing as 100% productivity that we need to strive for, preferably 110 or 125. People have good days and bad days. So you need to really think long term on this. And the same with when you're looking at, those good days and bad days. You're not looking at one really bad day where somebody's like, tearful or aggressive or something. You're looking at how are these things playing out over time. You really need to get to know each other and to watch each other in a longer period of time. And so that you can identify the outliers and then respond to those things. The other thing is offering resources, and those resources don't always have to be, especially in the nonprofit, there's not a lot of money to go buy fancy, healthcare plans or psychology. But there is often more of a culture that's allowed for flexibility within the workplace. So, when I talked earlier about giving people safe spaces, having perhaps appointed people that are the go-to, where you can just kind of like unburden your heart and move on if something particularly distressing happens. Allowing people to take their breaks, insisting that people take the break, when they're legally allowed to take a break. You should insist that they take that break because they really need that. So those are things internally that you can do that emphasize, we think it's really important. Um, Pay attention to this. So these are just some really simple, down to earth, starting best practices that kind of, in my experience, they kind of ripple effect. When you start with these things, looking at each other as individuals instead of as, labels and titles, when you normalize and acknowledge good days, bad days, everybody has mental health and it's okay. And some people have mental illness, and with mental illness, you can still flourish. So it's good to understand those things. And the last thing that I think is really important best practice that reduces conflict and makes it possible to address conflict when it's there is to train your managers. So many people are promoted and almost, punished for a job well done because they're really good at what they do, and then they get to become a manager, and then they don't get management skills. They're just going, this guy is really good at doing, the IT or putting the doohickey on the thingamabob, so we're going to promote them into a manager. And then they don't recognize that management is a whole other skill set and can be, even just the promotion itself can lead to conflict with the people that you used to work as a coworker, as an equal with. And now suddenly you have knowledge, you have power that they don't have. So train your managers. Those are, I think, the most simple best practice to start with, and to start opening that up so it can ripple out and keep growing.
Well, Rensia, thank you for your insights and wisdom around these really important issues. It's so appreciated. Thanks for joining us at Charity Village Connects.
Mary, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.